Well, good evening. I'm your host, Robert Wilson with Cowboy Wisdom Podcast. Tonight's podcast is 7 Ways Why Braggart Leadership Was My Mind-Made Insecurities Wearing a Megaphone. Why mind-made braggart leadership is manipulating and illusions controlling your life. In the fierce clarity of the Sonoran desert, my mind-made braggart leadership exposes itself as nothing more than psychological stagecraft, a loud illusion built from ego inflation. Certainty theater and emotional manipulation. The mind mistakes volume for vision, arrogance for authority, and exaggeration for authenticity, allowing braggart leaders to hijack attention and steer perception so that people will follow them because they think they're tough and smart. This leadership style thrives because it exploits the mind's addiction to confidence, dominance, and simple answers, creating a mirage of power that keeps people obedient to the loudest ego instead of the clearest reality or nowality. When sovereignty awakens, the manipulation dissolves, the illusions collapse under its own emptiness. Why braggart leadership was my mind-made insecurities wearing a megaphone. Braggart leadership was my insecurity wearing a megaphone. So in the Sonoran desert, it's obvious arrogance is a mind inflating itself to hide its own fragility. When the ego is empty, it brags. When it's threatened, it performs. When authenticity is near, it gets loud. It's a desert's forge ego exposure. Know-it-all certainty is ignorance pretending to be authority. The mind uses false certainty as a shield, forcing leaders to perform superiority instead of embodying expansion. The moment a leader stops learning, listening, and adapting, they stop leading and start acting. Certainty's my ignorant shield that keeps me blocked in yesterday. Why braggart leadership is mind-made egotistical arrogance controlling the world today. Braggart leadership dominates today because the mind mistakes loud ego for real authority. And through my Sonoran savvy clarity, I see how easily people surrender to the confidence theater instead of the actual competence of the person expressing leadership. Egotistical arrogance controls the world because the mind is addicted to certainty, and braggart leaders weaponize that addiction with bold claims, inflated self-importance, and emotional dominance that override critical awareness. Braggart leadership thrives because collective minds run on fear, approval, and social obedience. And those mind-made illusions make people follow the loudest voice instead of the authentic signal of their sovereign savvy until sovereignty finally snaps awake and quakes all the fake and bake of my braggart leadership. Why braggart leadership is mind-made know-it-all ignorance controlling the world today. Braggart leadership controls today's world because the mind confuses loud certainty with authentic wisdom. And in the high desert of the Sonora clarity, I see how easily people surrender to know-it-all ignorance packaged as authority. As know-it-all ignorance dominates because the mind is addicted to simple answers, bold claims, and emotional dominance. As the braggart leaders weaponize the addiction, overriding discernment with inflated ego and manufactured certainty. Braggart leaders thrive globally because collective minds run on fear, approval, and social obedience, and those mind-made illusions make people follow the loudest voice instead of the clearest authenticity. Until sovereignty finally snaps awake, Braggart leadership controls the world. What Braggart leadership is mind-made, Braggart's confidence. Braggart leadership dominates because the mind mistakes loud, inflated confidence for actual capability. And in my through my high desert clarity, I see how easily people surrender to the performance of certainty instead of the presence of authenticity. Braggart's confidence is mind-made because the ego builds its identity on exaggeration, dominance, and self-inflation. And people follow it because the mind is addicted to boldness, even when it's hollow. Mind is addicted to boldness, even when it's hollow and shallow. Braggart leadership thrives because collective minds prefer the illusion of strength over the discomfort of sovereignty. The loudest voice becomes a leader when people haven't yet awakened to their own inner authority and authenticity. Why Braggart leadership is mind-made corporate leadership. In the corporate corridor stretching from Mesa, Arizona to every global boardroom, Braggart leadership thrives because the mind mistakes inflated self-promotion for strategic intelligence, turning ego theater into a false badge of competence. Corporate culture rewards mind-made bravado because it's built on performance octaves. The louder the leader, the more the mind assumes they're decisive, even when the arrogance is masking shallow thinking and limited knowing. Braggart leadership dominates corporate systems because collective minds are conditioned to follow certainty over clarity, allowing ego-inflated leaders to control decisions, narratives, and direction simply by projecting dominance instead of delivering wisdom. Braggart leadership is mind-made enslaving mindsets. In the deepest clarity of my heart and soul, my Braggart leadership exposes itself as a mind-made illusion that traps people in low-frequency obedience, a psychological enslaving mindset where loud ego replaces actual insight. Braggart leadership manufactures mental dependence by flooding people with the exaggerating certainty, creating internal hierarchy, where the loudest voice becomes the master and the follower's intuition becomes the captive. Mind-made Braggart leadership thrives because it conditions people to shrink their sovereignty, turning self-doubt, fear, and approval seeking into an internal enslaving mindset that keeps them following the ego instead of their own clarity and listening and hearing what the business world is saying rather than hearkening the wisdom within themselves. Why mind-made Braggart leadership was my mind-made insecurity wearing a megaphone. Through my desert clarity, I saw that my Braggart leadership was never confidence. It was insecurity amplified, a mind-made megaphone broadcasting fear of inadequacy and disguised as certainty. My mind-made bravado wasn't strength. It was protection and a loud performance built to hide the quiet fear underneath, proving that Braggart leadership is just insecurity dressed up as dominance. Braggart leadership was my mind's survival script. A megaphone masking self-doubt, projecting exaggerated certainty to avoid being exposed until sovereignty snapped awake and revealed the illusion for what it was, liberating me to show the world my innovative talents. Why sovereign leadership hearkens intuitive wisdom and dismantles braggart leadership. In my desert clarity, savant leadership rises because it hearkens intuitive wisdom, a frequency braggart leadership can never counterfeit, overpower, or imitate, exposing ego-inflated leaders as noise without depth. And if you listen to the world today, you can recognize this in a lot of places. Savant leadership destroys braggart leadership because intuition cuts through performance while braggarts rely on volumes. Savants rely on inner wisdom, understanding, clarity, making their presence trustworthy, resonant, and impossible for the ego theater to compete with. Braggart leadership collapses under savant leadership because intuitive wisdom exposes the insecurity behind the megaphone of the phony pony of all egotistical arrogance, know-it-all ignorance, stubbornness, and hard-headedness. Sovereignty recognizes authenticity instantly, and once authenticity is felt, ego-inflated dominance loses all influence. Why the world is stuck in mind-made braggart leadership. The world is stuck in mind-made braggart leadership because collective minds confuse loud ego with real knowledge. And in the desert, through my desert clarity, I witness how easily people surrender to the confidence theater, instead of their sovereign wisdom. Mind-made braggart leadership dominates globally because the mind is addicted to certainty, dominance, and emotional intensity. Braggarts weaponize this addiction, turning inflated self-promotion into a psychological control system. The world remains trapped in braggart leadership because people haven't awakened to their own sovereignty. Mind-made fear, approval seeking, and social obedience keep people following the loudest voice instead of the clearest authenticity. Why braggart leadership lowers companies' profits. Braggart leadership drains profits because ego-driven decision-making replaces data, intuition, and strategy. And through my desert clarity, I witness how loud leaders burn money by chasing validation over the value. Companies lose profits under braggart leadership because know-it-all ignorance silences talent. Innovation collapses, teams disengage, and the organization becomes a shrine to the leader's ego instead of an innovative generator raising revenue. Braggart leadership destroys profitability because it creates a culture of fear, reactivity, and short-term optics. The loudest voice forces rush choices, inflated risk, and operational chaos that bleeds money from the inside out. Why braggart leadership dismantles employee morale. Braggart leadership crushes morale because ego-inflated leaders hoard credit and broadcast their greatness, leaving employees in Mesa and beyond feeling unseen, undervalued, and energetically drained. Employee morale collapses under braggart leadership because arrogance silences contribution, and teams stop speaking up. Creativity dies, the workplace becomes a stage for leaders' performance instead of a space for shared brilliance. Braggart leadership dismantles morale by creating a fear-based culture where employees shrink to avoid criticism. The loud ego becomes the center of gravity, and everyone else learns to dim their light to survive. Why Braggart leadership invokes a toxic workplace. Braggart leadership poisons the workplace because of ego-inflated leaders dominate the room, hijacking attention and suffocating contribution, turning teams into spectators of the leader's self-promotion instead of participants of their shared success. A toxic culture forms under Braggart leadership because arrogance silences psychological safety. Employees stop speaking up. Creativity collapses and the workplace becomes a fear-based arena. Survival matters more than innovation. Braggart leadership triggers toxicity because the loud ego creates an instability, constant self-promotion, blame shifting, and emotional volatility. Erodes trust, leaving teams drained, defensive, and disconnected from their own wisdom, insight, and clarity. Why Braggart leadership is mind-made ancestor survival mode programming. Braggart leadership is an ancestor survival mode programming because the mind still believes dominance equals safety, and in the raw clarity of the Sonora Desert, you see how loud ego is, just an ancient survival script. That's all the ego is an ancient survival script, masquerading as modern leadership. The mind defaults to Braggart leadership because ancient survival wiring rewarded the loudest, boldest, most dominant voice, a prehistoric strategy that now creates dysfunctional leaders who confuse intimidation with intelligence. Braggart leadership persists because unexamined ancestral programming keeps people obeying confidence. A confidence theater, survival mode minds follow the biggest signal, while sovereign minds of the world awaken to the illusion and break the lineage of fear-based leadership. That's all Braggart leadership is fear-based leadership. Why Braggart leadership shuts off listening. Braggart leadership shuts off listening because ego-inflated leaders treat every conversation as a stage, never a dialogue. And in the desert, you see how their need to dominate kills curiosity, connection, and communication, destroying the contours of the company. Listening collapses under Braggart leadership because arrogance blocks of feedback. The know-it-all mind can't receive insight, challenge, or nuance, turning the workplace into a one-way broadcast instead of a collaborated ecosystem. Braggart leadership shuts off listening because insecurity hides behind volume. The louder the ego, the more terrified it is of hearing truth. So it drowns out every voice that might expose its fragility. Why Braggart leadership lives today through yesterday's mindset. Braggart leadership survives today in running on yesterday's mindset and outdated survival scripts, where dominance, loudness, and ego were mistaken for strength, and a pattern still visible from boardrooms from around the world. Yesterday's mindset fuels Braggart leadership because the mind clings to old hierarchies. The belief that the loudest voice deserves authority, even though modern teams require intuition, collaboration, contours, and communication, and emotional wisdom. to rise, shine, and energize their daily outcomes. Braggart leaders persist because unexamined mental programming keeps people loyal to old power structures. Yesterday's mindsets rewards a confidence theater, while today's world demands sovereign clarity and authentic presence. Why Braggart leadership lives today through yesterday's mindset as Braggart leadership survives today because it's running on yesterday's mindset and programming and scripts, and on an outdated survival script where dominance, loudness, and ego were mistaken for strength, a pattern and still visible from boardrooms from around the world. Yesterday's mindset fuels Braggart leadership because the mind clings to old hierarchies, the belief that the loudest voice deserves authority, even though modern teams require intuition, collaboration, and emotional intelligence and enterprising wisdom. Braggart leadership persists because unexamined mental programming keeps people loyal to old power structures. Yesterday's mindset rewards the confidence theater, while today's world demands sovereign clarity and authentic presence of your wisdom. Why Braggart leadership creates an unsettling domestic landscape. Because the mindset and everything you're putting out goes home with you. Braggart leadership destabilizes the domestic landscape because ego-inflated leaders turn homes and workplaces into emotional battlegrounds. Their loud certainty creates tension, unpredictability, and a constant sense of walking on eggshells. How does your mindset and your egotistical arrogance and your Braggart leadership go home so your kids and your wife and everybody walks on eggshells around you? I did that. Not no more, but I did. An unsettling domestic environment forms under a Braggart leadership because arrogance blocks empathy. The louder the ego, the less room there is for listening, connection, contours, communication, and emotional liberation, leaving everyone around them drained and defensive. Braggart leadership disrupts domestic harmony because insecurity hides behind dominance. The megaphone ego demands control, validation, compliance, creating a climate of fear, resentment, and chronic unease. Why Braggart leadership is mind-made, stubborn sabotage, hard-headed hidden haunts. Braggart leadership becomes stubborn sabotage because the mind clings to its own inflated identity, and through my desert clarity I see how the ego turns rigid and hard-headed and self-protected, sabotaging progress to preserve its illusion of superiority. Braggart leadership is fueled by mind-made hard-headedness because insecurity hides behind certainty. The louder the ego, the more it resists feedback, correction, or growth, creating a leadership style that sabotages innovation and team cohesion. Braggart leadership carries a hidden haunts because the mind buries unresolved fears beneath the bravado. Those unexamined shadows drive reactive decisions, emotional vitality, and sabotage cycles that infect the entire workplace. Why sovereign leadership, energetic liberation, energized listening, and maverick questions destroys Braggart leadership, egotistical arrogance, and know-it-all ignorance. Sovereign leadership annihilates braggart leadership because energetic liberation dissolves the ego theater. In the fierce clarity of my heart and soul, sovereignty exposes the hollowness of loud confidence and replaces it with grounded presence that braggarts can never imitate or overpower. Energized listening destroys braggart leadership because deep attuned presence reveals what ego tries to hide. While braggarts broadcast noise, sovereign leaderships hearken authenticity, making their influence magnetic, stabilizing, and possible for arrogance to compete with. Leadership failure and they with leadership failure, authentic communication, and power that dissolves as sovereign liberation flows through the situation. Maverick questions dismantle braggart leadership because they pierce the illusion of bold, authentic, cutting inquiry exposes the insecurity behind the megaphone, forcing the ego-inflated leaders into clarity they can never control, dodge, or dominate. Why autonomous expansion, politically incorrect inspiration, cowboy wisdom, liberating lingo, outlaw optimism, revolutionary revelations, and calm celebration effortlessly rise you out of braggart leadership, egotistical arrogance, know-it-all ignorance, stubbornness, and hard-headedness. Autonomous expansion rises you out of braggart leadership because sovereignty dissolves ego-inflated ways. As my desert clarity unleashes my politically incorrect inspiration and cowboy wisdom, break the mind's addiction to arrogance, hard-headedness, and know-it-all ignorance. Liberating lingo and outlaw optimism dismantle braggart tendencies because they now wire your internal frequencies instead of projecting insecurity and immaturity through loud certainty. You transmit grounded clarity, humor, and a desert forge presence that ego-driven stubbornness can never survive. Revolutionary revelations and calm celebrations free you from braggart leadership because they rise you out of the mind tensions and to embody sovereignty. When your nervous system steadies and your insight sharpens, arrogance and ignorance and hard-headedness lose all gravitational pull. As you rise through all this, you're going to understand that braggart leadership is you watch people stand on stage and kind of hammer their deal, but your sovereign savvy and your sovereign serenity will rise you out of that because you encompass the grit, get, and go to do whatever you desire, to experience what you desire. And see, that's something I really opened up to. Is I'm never going to do this. I have the desire to experience this fresh outcome. See how that fresh outcome is here and now? And I am Robert Wilson with Cowboy Wisdom, and I want to thank you. And may your life always be a blessing, as you are a blessing to me in the world.